Ever wondered how the trials of Dead by Daylight would go if the killers remained unchanged by the entity? If the killers were lore accurate. Take Nemesis for example, a character who bursts through walls, can crush you with ease, and is essentially a walking tank, yet gets stunned by a pallet. Today we're going to consider how strong the killers would be if the entity left them unchanged. How strong should they be lore accurately? Here's our tiers, and let's get into it. They would be far weaker. This is our tier for the characters who would really suffer without the entity's intervention and changes. Spirit was just a person before the realm and was literally sliced up by her father, and so lore accurately should be in literal pieces without the entity's power or intervention, meaning she'd be literally incapable of even hunting the survivors, so she's got to be the lowest tier, I think. Nurse had just come out of an ambulance crash during her lore when she gets taken. It's here seemingly where the entity transforms her greatly into her more ghostly appearance and provides her with new powers in the realm. Without the entity doing this, she'd just literally be dead, probably, at least by gauging the look of her injuries. Maybe similar to Spirit, she'd be able to move slightly, but it wouldn't be good. The entity saves her technically, but that's obviously a generous interpretation because it also put her in that situation. Artist is similar in that she was physically injured when taken, having her hands and tongue freshly cut off and out. She also didn't have her powers then from the entity, leaving her pretty useless in trial to do just about anything to the survivors. Plague would be one of the worst of characters, with her literally dying of the plague when she gets taken. If the entity didn't change her, weaponizing the plague and making it into a power instead of a detriment, she'd end up as just an incredibly sick woman who would struggle to get around the trials and hunt the survivors at all. Pig is sort of just a human in reality and wouldn't be able to do all too much, to be completely honest, against 4 survivors who would be the same size as her or in some cases bigger. We have to consider of course that all the regular human characters don't get the height or strength buffs the entity gives them. All she has really is her hidden blade, and she's lumbered down by a hulking pighead. In reality, she'd be insanely weak. Trickster is fairly similar, where he's just a guy and he doesn't look particularly strong. Sure, he's got his blades, but these things shatter on impact. He also could not handle 4 survivors trying to overwhelm him during the trials. Trickster often caught people on his own terms, bound them up tightly. Without this, he'd definitely lose most encounters with the survivors. Imagine if he has to face a character like David, for example. Good luck, bro. Legion would sort of be the same, although not quite to the same extent. They'd no longer have their feral frenzy, and of course they're all just teenagers. Most of them could be feasibly overpowered by almost any of the cast of survivors, and especially if all 4 teamed up. We even somewhat see this in their Mori. Legion would be far weaker, and at best might be able to take down the survivors one by one due to their stab wound studies. Chucky, I just think realistically would not be able to take down 4 survivors, especially if they're all aware of him. He's debatably the easiest of any of the characters to overpower. And if we're being real, he'd be able to get kicked much like Victor does. He'd be pretty useless, but hey, he does also prove himself in crazy ways during the film, so maybe I'm being unfair here. They would be slightly weaker. This is our tier for the characters who wouldn't change much from their DBD versions, but would be slightly weaker. Trapper, I would say, has seemingly been buffed up a bit by the entity, and so would be weaker in the trials without its helps and buffs. He has hooks piercing his skin. That isn't normal for a person to be able to withstand, so he clearly has more durability and strength in the realm with the buffs. Looking at him before the realm, he looks quite different though. Even if this is him when he's younger, it's still a stark difference. He'd just be a strong guy in the realm now, and likely much shorter too, so he would be less deadly. Wraith is much the same, where he's clearly very strong prior to the realm and the entity, able to tear out AZHYMOVS' skull and spine with ease. But he'd also lack his cloak ability and likely wouldn't be as physically tall either, so he'd be slightly weaker but not by much. Sort of just identical situation to Trapper. Twins, I would say, are marginally weaker. In the realm they're made bigger, but also given the ability to detach from one another, which allows them to attack far more easily. It's worth remembering they were still very formidable though in their lore, and did get through a lot and fought a lot of people to survive. So they're not weak by any stretch either, but I do think they're overall weaker than how they're presented in the trials. Doctor, I'd go for a similar idea too. He would still be strong with his knowledge and intelligence and brutal bat, but he'd also be shorter, weaker, and lack the inexhaustible electrical spark in his heart given to him by the entity, meaning he wouldn't be able to shoot electricity anymore. So still scary, but not as formidable as many others. I do think he could put to use his tactics a bit more though, and potentially would be less crazy too, as it's theorized the whole headpiece he has is also the entity's doing. Billy is on this same trend of him having a lot of strength, but also clearly being buffed in the realm. Before, he has a limp where he was shot in the leg too, but this doesn't seem to inhibit him at all really in the trials, with him able to sprint incredibly quickly. I think realistically he would not be able to do this with that kind of injury, but he does still have a chainsaw, which enables him to do far more to the survivors than some of the other regular humans with their more basic tools. Clown is pretty huge seemingly, even without the entity's changes, and is said to be very strong, but he's also very lumbering and slowed by his many vices he uses. He wouldn't be that formidable, I think, and would struggle in many cases to keep up with the survivors, and their speed, I think, especially. But if he got near to them, it would be an almost impossible escape. Krasue, I think, would be weaker too. She too has been sized up somewhat, and then simply I think her Krasue form would be far more prone to damage due to its vulnerability with all of the exposed parts of it. Then again, it's like a supernatural creature, so maybe not entirely, but I don't know, maybe the survivors could capture the head and like, I don't know, hide it in a jar or something, who knows. They wouldn't change. This is for the characters who would basically just be the same, the characters who are pretty much lore accurate already, or at least they're on par in some way. Myers, I think, wouldn't change. He's sort of already seemingly doing what he pleases in the trials, and although he does appear slightly physically differently, his powers seem entirely intact. So I'd say basically the same. Pallets would affect him still, as they do in Halloween. In Halloween, he's still affected by stabs and shots and things being thrown at him, so this aligns fine. I'd say the one difference is his ability to teleport. However, I'm not sure if this would actually benefit him by much, or even out the nerfs to him in other ways, as he doesn't really have like a slaughtering strike in the films either, so I feel like those are pretty on par as abilities. He's also, of course, much physically bulkier in-game than he is in the films, so again, I feel like it's all kind of evened out. Hag wouldn't change really either, I think. She was already transformed before coming to the trials seemingly by the Hex magic, although maybe by the Entity's magic as well, a debatable one. However, I think she would act about the same, with maybe the exception of being a bit more animalistic. Maybe should have a slightly wider range of hexes as well. It's a bit hard to tell, but it's certainly possible. Overall though, I think she's around the same level of power. Bubba I also think would be largely unchanged. He's pretty strong in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and his main strength in the realm is his chainsaw, which he'd still have. He'd maybe be a bit smaller, but that's about it, I'd say. Largely he'd be unchanged, and I think he could still overpower most of the survivors, honestly. Ghostface I'd also say isn't that different. He's just a guy, sure, but he's also very intelligent and meticulous. The main difference would be that he's much shorter probably, and he could likely still get overwhelmed pretty easily by the 4 survivors if they wanted to all go for him. However, he is sneaky, and maybe he could avoid this unlike some of the other human killers. Oh, and he also wouldn't have the floaty bits on his outfit, which is probably a benefit, to be completely honest. It probably gives him away a bit too much. Springtrap wouldn't change much strength-wise, I think. He would be more durable and is unkillable, but physically I don't think he'd be much different and would actually perform relatively the same in trials, maybe a bit weaker. Debatably, if he didn't have the entity-given security doors to move through, he would struggle a bit more. His springlock suit would surely boost his attack damage though overall, balancing this out. They'd be stronger. This is our tier for the characters who would have notable power increases and would be clearly stronger than their realm selves. Skull Merchant may be surprising to see so high, but she's actually very capable and formidable. Her drones are debatably heavily nerfed in the realm, and her dual blade is shown to do horrible amounts of damage when swung at someone, likely due to the mechanized force behind it that causes it to literally slice people in half. So she's actually probably nerfed down. She'd always know where you were and could take survivors down in an instant if she chose, but she does also have clear entity buffs with her being larger and stronger and stuff like that. Houndmaster is another really scary character who would be about as formidable as she's shown in the trials, with her being feared by entire pirate crews even when she stood alone against them. Her powers are also gained seemingly prior to the realm and from an overlap, and not the entity, and so upon entering she'd still be very powerful. The main change I'd say is herself and Snug being sized up. Deathslinger was also renowned as a deadly bounty hunter with various contraptions and seemingly an unbroken success rate for catching his targets. However, he wouldn't be too unchanged, honestly. He's still got his limp in the trials, and his spear gun is restricted to just one shot. The pallets could still also plausibly delay him to some degree, meaning I think he would be stronger, but likely not by much. Singularity is lore accurately much stronger than he appears in the trials, with him likely being able to skewer and kill the survivors in one blow in reality. He doesn't change that much though, as he would still be deformed after the explosion caused by Gabriel, as this wasn't the entity's doing. This means it's quite likely that he actually doesn't change all too much, but is notably stronger still. They'd be much stronger. This is our tier for the characters who would be far stronger than their realm selves, and likely pretty unstoppable. Huntress is often joked to be much like an anime antagonist with the way she leaps about and cuts through hundreds of soldiers with ease. Anna is very toned down for the realm, and I think realistically would be downing survivors with a single hatchet and just grabbing and throwing them around and such. She'd be much more brutal than how she appears in game, and would be considerably stronger. Demogorgon would be the same. As we see in Stranger Things, demos are able to just charge through a hallway pretty much, and bullets and knives and whatever else does nothing to them. So good luck with that pallet. Demos should be pretty much unstoppable and impossible to outrun with them being so fast and having keen tracking skills. Oni would be... poor survivors. Oni is a monster in his lore, cutting through hundreds on his dark pilgrimage across Japan. No one really manages to challenge his strength in any meaningful way, and the closest someone gets is probably his own father, who was a famed samurai. Oni is horrendously deadly, although he would lose his Blood Fury powers as their entity given. He'd debatably be stronger with the pallets also no longer stopping him nearly as much too. He'd just burst through those. Pyramid Head is shown off to be literally indestructible in Silent Hill, and so the survivors are pretty screwed in DBD. He would lack some of his entity given abilities like his ranged attack and trails however, but overall he'd still be stronger due to him being unable to get stunned or blinded at all. He'd be a walking tank that would eventually catch them. Blight is a bit tough because it could be argued he may be considerably weaker and actually nerfed down by his crippling Blight addiction. However, he could also be stronger too, with the entity presumably toning down the serum as well, leaving Blight muted to some degree. Blight is powerful for sure, and his serum would be unleashed without the entity's control over him, allowing him to be even more deadly in the trials, but also potentially fall to his addiction far more, so this one is debatable. Knight is seen as pure evil, not too dissimilarly to someone like Myers. The difference between them is he has a huge sword, and if we also remove the entity's effects off of the guards, then he's also got all three guards too, which means they're going to be near inescapable and so overpowered. Knight outclassed every foe he ever faced, and the four of them took on a literal army together, so good luck, survivors. Xenomorph would be incredibly effective if it weren't nerfed like it is in the realm, with it being far more resistant than it is in the trials, able to also be far stealthier and likely climb walls and get to areas most other killers couldn't. Xenos would also likely be able to kill with a single attack, and it would be considerably hard for any of the survivors to overpower them. Unknown is a bit tough to tell of course, but it seems like it'd be stronger. We don't really know what it does to people, but it's clearly able to physically overwhelm them easily due to how long it's done this for, and also how we can visually see that it steals people's skin. Unknown is presumably very strong and capable of just overwhelming just about anyone. We can also assume it would run on all fours as well, allowing it to catch survivors far more easily, and in general have a wider access to its many deceptive powers we hear about in the lore, like its effect on lights and greater hallucinations in its victims. Kaneki is insanely strong if we see him going fully unleashed in the anime. Of course we only have up to season 1 Kaneki, but even so, he's far quicker, more agile, and his Kagane does insane degrees of damage. I'd say the only nerf he'd he'd get is he'd be slightly smaller, as he has been sized up in the realm. They'd be overpowered. This is our tier for the characters who would likely be far too OP if they were unrestricted in the realm and would be able to do some crazy stuff. Wesker would be far quicker, stronger, but also likely a bit shorter, I guess, would be his one downside. Lore accurately, he'd be able to move far quicker, clearing ground in a blink of an eye. When he fights people like Chris, we can see this, although he sort of goes easy on him because he secretly has a crush on Chris. In DBD though, I imagine he'd be far more brutal and aggressive toward the survivors if he were allowed to be, basically. Nemesis would be wildly powerful, with him, for one, being twice the size of his DBD version, but also able to just walk through just about anything the survivors could throw in his way, like pallets or flashlights or walls even. He could sprint at the survivors full speed, bust through walls, and swipe aside pretty much anyone in his way, grabbing them and crushing them with ease. Freddy would more than likely be insanely overpowered if the entity didn't restrict him. He's a character actually directly noted to have been nerfed by the entity, with his powers said to be tempered. He's able to have essentially complete control over people once they're inside of the dream world, and is still able to attack and even kill them, even if they're not in it yet. So he's pretty much inescapable, and the length of the trials would be decided by how long he would want them to go on for. Pinhead would be incredibly tough to escape, as he's a character that can infinitely bind you with chains that he can summon from the labyrinth. He's largely immune to damage, and the pallets and flashbangs would surely do very little against him. Whilst he may move a bit slower than others, he is definitely no less deadly, and is even shown in the films to just wipe out people en masse on occasion, if he wants to. Sadako is debatable a bit, as you could make the argument that she has to wait 7 days to actually kill any of the survivors, and then need to first watch the tape before she can do. However, lore accurately, this isn't the case. This tends to be what she does, but it's not the only way she can kill. The tape is just one of the ways. She's also able to just use her telekinetic powers, as seen in game, to literally just go pick someone up and snap them up if she likes, so yeah, it would be a very short match, I think. Dredge would literally be unstoppable, and lore accurately would cloak the trial grounds in complete darkness all of the time with its presence. In the lore, the darkness seems to spread everywhere all the time when it's present. The creature seems to also be far bigger in the lore, spanning as far as the darkness reaches, and not necessarily having a narrowed form as we see in the realm. At least seemingly. That's a debatable one. Therefore, you'd likely just get instantly consumed by it upon spawning in. Or at least, I don't know, it would decide when you get consumed. There's no escape. Dracula would likely be far more vicious and unrelenting toward the survivors than what we see, wanting to quickly dispose of all of the humans. He would be far quicker, far more brutal, and could likely kill each survivor within seconds of seeing them, with his full power capability allowing him to quickly swoop toward them and slice them down, or fly over, or whatever. Bust out the true form, whatever he's feeling like. Vecna could probably just like snap his fingers and all the survivors would instantly perish or something. Vecna is very powerful, and his range of spells is greatly neutered in the realm, due to his Mark of Negation. He's the one killer in DBD who has the mark, and it's a sign of his overwhelming strength. So yeah, Vecna could probably just like Thanos snap the survivors, genuinely. Alright, well, that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts as always down below. And drop a sub. Subscribe if you haven't. I don't remember the last time. Alright, anyway. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.